Imagine a room where the air pressure is dropping so rapidly your ears pop. The temperature plummets, but there is no wind, no movement, just absolute, suffocating stillness. This is the exact atmospheric state of an empath who has reached the true end of their baseline consistency. For years, pop psychology has sold you a myth. They told you that when an empath is pushed to their limit, they cry, they slam doors, or they run away to heal their wounded souls. That is a lie. That is merely stage 2 or 3, the reactive phases where compliance loops are still fighting to maintain the relationship. What nobody talks about, and what behavioral mechanics actually reveal, is the final phase. It is a psychological phenomenon I call the absolute zero. In this speech, we are going to strip away the emotional fluff and look at the raw, cold architecture of what happens when a highly perceptive psychological system completely de-authorizes an individual. When this shift occurs, it isn't born out of anger. Anger is a high-energy state. It requires fuel, and it proves the target still has equity in the empath's mind. No, the final stage is a total behavioral flatline. It is the moment the empath's brain shifts from an asset allocation strategy to a complete asset liquidation strategy. They look at a narcissist, a manipulator, or a toxic partner, and the neurological switch flips. If you have ever wondered why someone who used to bleed for you suddenly looks at you with the emotional warmth of a marble statue, or if you are currently feeling an eerie, calm detachment settling into your own chest after years of chaos, you need to understand the mechanics of this terminal threshold. We will break down the exact micro-expressions, the linguistic shifts, and the irreversible neural rewiring that happens during this silent fracture. By the end of this breakdown, you will know exactly how to recognize this point of no return, and why, once a genuine empath enters this final stage, no amount of manipulation, guilt, or behavioral tracking can ever pull them back. You aren't just watching a speech about feelings, you are about to study the anatomy of an absolute psychological shutdown. Every human being operates on a behavioral baseline, a predictable pattern of choices, vocal tones, and emotional investments. For a highly perceptive, deeply empathetic individual, that baseline is typically characterized by an over-allocation of psychological equity. They overread your micro-expressions, they adjust their posture to accommodate your discomfort, and they fundamentally absorb the emotional fallout of your poor behavior. They do this because their cognitive architecture is wired for compliance and connection. But there is a critical vulnerability in this system that most behavioral profilers completely miss. When you push an empath, you expect a reaction. You expect the tears, the long paragraphs of text, the desperate pleas for clarity, or the explosive arguments. Manipulators feast on this reaction because it provides a clear metric. As long as they are reacting, they are still under control. The compliance loop is holding. But what happens when the loop snaps? Most people think the final stage of an empath's patience is a massive explosion or a dramatic exit. It isn't. The final stage is something far more chilling. It is a state of total, unmanipulable stillness. If you do not understand the mechanics of this specific psychological event, you will misread the compliance metrics completely, and you will find yourself permanently locked out of a relationship before you even realize you've crossed the line. If you are an empath, understanding this stage is your ultimate protection. If you are observing one, this is your final warning. When we look at behavioral profiling, we track energy. Anger is high energy. Grief is high energy. Even a door-slamming exit is a high-energy behavioral projection. But the final stage of patience is a state of absolute zero. In physics, absolute zero is the temperature at which all thermodynamic movement stops. In human behavior, it is the moment the empath's brain completely de-authorizes the target. When a genuine empath reaches this terminal threshold, a profound shift occurs in their psychological architecture. The human brain is an efficiency engine. It hates wasting resources. For months or years, The empath's brain has been spending massive amounts of cognitive energy trying to rationalize a toxic dynamic. It creates excuses, analyzes nuances, and searches for hidden pain in the perpetrator to justify staying. Then, the threshold is crossed. It doesn't happen during a fight. It usually happens on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, over a cup of coffee, or during a mundane conversation. The brain looks at the data, realizes the return on investment is exactly zero, and initiates an immediate systemic shutdown of that specific relationship vector. If you observe an empath entering this final stage, the behavioral metrics shift instantly. First, look at the linguistic patterns. The long paragraphs stop. The explanations stop. The empath stops saying, "It hurts me when you do X," because they no longer care if you know it hurts. They stop trying to correct your behavior. Instead, their language becomes intensely transactional. They use closed sentences. Yes, no, okay, I understand. There is no pitch variance, no emotional tremor, and zero underlying resentment. It is the verbal equivalent of a dial tone. Second, observe the microexpressions. When an empath is still invested, their face is a canvas of microexpressions, fleeting signs of hurt, hope, or frustration. In the final stage, the face becomes flat. The blink rate stabilizes. When you look into their eyes, you aren't looking at someone who is mad at you. You are looking at someone who is looking through you. You have been downgraded from a human agent of chaos to an inanimate object in their environment. To understand why this is terrifying to a manipulator, you have to understand the shift from asset allocation to asset liquidation. In the early stages of a toxic dynamic, the empath is in asset allocation mode. They are throwing more empathy, more patience, and more understanding at the problem, hoping to balance the emotional ledger. In the final stage, the ledger is closed. The empath's brain enters liquidation mode. They begin quietly disconnecting the tethers. They don't threaten to leave. Threatening to leave is a negotiation tactic used to get the other person to change. The empath in the final stage is no longer negotiating. They are quietly moving accounts, restructuring their schedule, and mentally mapping a reality where the target does not exist. A narcissist or an opportunistic predator relies on your emotional feedback to calibrate their next move. If they gaslight you and you get upset, they know the gaslighting worked. But when they gaslight an empath who has reached absolute zero, the empath simply nods and says, "If that's how you see it." The manipulator's tools rely entirely on your emotional conductivity. When you become completely non-conductive, their entire behavioral strategy collapses. They are hacking at a wall of smoke. Here is the truth that nobody talks about. This stage is completely irreversible. Why? Because it wasn't triggered by an emotional reaction. It was triggered by a systemic cognitive conclusion. You can apologize, you can change your behavior, you can use the most sophisticated love-bombing tactics in your arsenal, but it will not work. When an empath is angry, you can appease them. When they are sad, you can comfort them. But when they are done, the psychological architecture that allowed them to feel empathy for you has been physically dismantled. The neural pathways have been pruned. They still have empathy for the rest of the world, for the stray dog, for the cashier, for their friends. But when they turn their gaze to you, the system reads a dead signal. The final stage of an empath's patience is not a war, it is a ghost town. It is the quiet realization that the person who used to fight for you has simply stopped looking for you. If you are currently experiencing this terrifying calm within yourself, realize that it is not a breakdown. It is your psychological immune system finally doing its job. It is your brain taking the keys back from someone who refused to respect the house. And if you are the one who pushed them there, understand this. You didn't win the argument, and you didn't successfully break their spirit. You simply wore out the mechanism. And once that mechanism stops, there is no technician on earth who can turn it back on for you. The silence you are hearing isn't a pause. It's the end of the broadcast. When we analyze human behavior through the lens of psychological architecture, The absolute baseline of interpersonal connection rests on authorization. To understand the collapse of an empath's patience, you must first understand this hidden mechanism. Every day, every hour, we unconsciously grant the people around us the authority to affect our emotional state. We hand them a psychological passcode that allows their tone of voice, their micro-expressions, and their structural choices to directly influence our nervous system. For a highly perceptive individual, this authorization is vast. They don't just grant access, they open the entire perimeter. They actively interpret your size, they adjust their posture to mirror your comfort, and they calibrate their own communication to minimize your friction. This is not an accidental trait. It is a highly active, energy-consuming cognitive strategy designed to maintain relational equilibrium. They have authorized your behavior to matter. In fact, they have authorized it to be the primary data stream directing their internal landscape. However, Keynote 1 highlights the precise moment this foundational mechanism undergoes a total structural deauthorization. This is not a gradual fading of affection, nor is it a temporary defensive wall built out of spite. It is a calculated, systemic revocation of your access privileges. When an empath reaches this terminal threshold, their brain treats the target the same way a computer operating system treats a corrupted piece of software. It revokes its security clearance and isolates it from the core registry. Suddenly, the passcode you used to use to manipulate, wound, or destabilize them no longer functions. You can throw the exact same emotional triggers at them that used to cause a 3-day psychological spiral, and the response you receive will be a flat line. The target's ability to influence the empath's emotional baseline is not just suppressed, it is completely erased from the cognitive architecture. This deauthorization shifts the empath from emotional reactivity to absolute indifference. In behavioral profiling, we monitor emotional reactivity as a primary metric of engagement. If an individual is screaming, crying, defending themselves, or even withdrawing in visible agony, they are still highly reactive. Their system is still processing the target's input as valid data that requires an internal adjustment. They are still actively authorizing the target to dictate the terms of the environment. But when true deauthorization occurs, the target's actions are instantly stripped of their psychological meaning. If the target attempts a gaslighting loop, the empath's brain no longer scrambles to find the logic or defend its sanity. It simply observes the words as meaningless acoustic waves. The target's anger is no longer viewed as a threat or a sign of pain to be healed. It is cataloged as a minor, irrelevant fluctuation in the background environment, no more significant than the humming of a refrigerator or a change in the weather. The empath stops looking for the why behind the target's cruelty because the target's entire psychological profile has been marked as completely bankrupt. They have completely decoupled their internal nervous system from the target's behavioral choices, resulting in a state of unshakable, bulletproof detachment that cannot be reached through willpower alone, but only through this total structural shift. To accurately profile the terminal breakdown of an empath's patience, we must completely dismantle the mainstream fallacy surrounding human anger. In popular culture and superficial psychological discussions, anger is often framed as the ultimate boundary, the final explosive proof that someone has had enough. We are conditioned to look at slamming doors, raised voices, and sharp, biting retorts as the metrics of a relationship's end. But from a behavioral mechanics perspective, this interpretation is completely backwards. Anger is not the end of a dynamic. It is a violent, high-energy reinvestment in it. When an individual expresses anger toward a partner, a friend, or a manipulator, they are actively broadcasting a profound psychological reality. You still have equity in my mind. They are screaming because they still expect you to hear them. They are fighting because they still believe there is something left to save, or at the very least, They believe your compliance can still be forced through emotional pressure. Anger requires an immense amount of metabolic and cognitive fuel. It causes the heart rate to spike, floods the system with cortisol and adrenaline, and forces the brain to spend massive computational power tracking the target's reactions. Keynote 2 exposes the fallacy of this high-energy state and contrasts it with the cold reality of true psychological termination. When a highly perceptive individual finally reaches the absolute end of their patience, the volume doesn't go up, it drops to zero. True termination has no heat, no friction, and requires absolutely no narrative justification. An empath who is still angry is an empath who is still trapped in a stage 2 or stage 3 reactive compliance loop. They are hurting, which means they are still feeling your impact. But when they cross into the final stage, they realize that anger is a luxury they can no longer afford to waste on you. They realize that screaming at a wall doesn't break the wall, it only breaks the person screaming. Consequently, the emotional temperature flatlines. The need to explain, to defend, or to force the target to understand their perspective vanishes entirely. This total absence of anger is what makes this stage so unsettling to a behavioral predator or a narcissistic personality type. A manipulator is highly skilled at navigating anger. If you yell at them, they can label you as irrational, weaponize your reaction against you, or use your emotional spike to fuel a fresh cycle of drama. They understand how to trade in the currency of conflict. But when the empath steps completely outside the arena of anger, the manipulator loses all leverage. The empath stops demanding explanations, stops issuing ultimatums, and completely abandons the desire for closure or an apology. They don't need a narrative justification to walk away or to emotionally detach because the data itself has become self-evident. They no longer care if the target agrees with their assessment or understands their pain. This silent, heatless detachment is the ultimate execution of a boundary. It is the moment the empath recognizes that providing an emotional reaction is an act of charity, and they have officially closed the vault. When an individual shifts from an active emotional investment to a state of permanent detachment, the change is not just an internal psychological shift, it manifests in highly specific, measurable alterations in their communication mechanics. In behavioral analysis, we look closely at microlinguistic shifting, the subtle, often unconscious changes in word choice, syntax, and speech patterns that reveal an individual's underlying cognitive state. When a highly perceptive empath reaches the final stage of patience, their entire linguistic architecture undergoes a drastic structural transformation. During the earlier stages of a toxic dynamic, an empath's language is characterized by an overabundance of emotional qualifiers, tentative phrasing, and extensive narrative explanations. They will use phrases like, "I feel like you aren't understanding me," or "It really hurts when you say those things because I only wanted to help." This highly descriptive, vulnerable language is an active attempt to build a bridge, to provide the target with the necessary emotional data to correct their behavioral trajectory. However, Keynote 3 focuses on the abrupt termination of this linguistic charity. The moment the psychological switch flips into absolute de-authorization, the empath's verbal output instantly transitions into a purely transactional model. They completely strip away the emotional fluff, the qualifiers, and the explanatory narratives that once defined their speech. The long, multi-paragraph text messages intended to resolve conflicts disappear entirely, replaced by cold, factual brevity. When confronted, blamed, or provoked, their responses collapse into single-syllable acknowledgments. Yes. No. Okay. I see. This is not the passive-aggressive silence of someone throwing a tantrum or trying to punish the target with the silent treatment. It is the utter elimination of unnecessary cognitive expenditure. The empath has realized that providing context or emotional data to the target is a waste of mental currency. Therefore, their language becomes a tool for logistics only, designed to navigate the immediate physical reality without allowing any emotional conductivity to pass through the wire. Furthermore, this microlinguistic shift involves the complete removal of future-oriented or relationship-building terminology. The empath stops using inclusive pronouns like we or our when discussing the future, unconsciously or consciously separating their timeline from the target's timeline. They stop asking open-ended questions that invite the target to share their thoughts or feelings, effectively closing off any channels for deeper interpersonal exploration. If the target attempts to initiate a familiar argument or trigger a known emotional loop, the empath refuses to take the linguistic bait. Instead of defending their position or matching the target's vocal intensity, they employ a technique of absolute brevity that acts as a conversational dead end. They might simply say, "You are entitled to your opinion," or "I am not going to discuss this," delivered in a flat, uninflected vocal tone, devoid of pitch variance or emotional tremor. This linguistic flattening completely diffuses the manipulator's tactical playbook. A behavioral predator relies on the target's verbal defense mechanisms to find fresh angles of attack, to twist meanings, and to perpetuate compliance loops. By adopting an unyielding, transactional brevity, the empath denies the manipulator the semantic raw material required to sustain the conflict. To fully comprehend the depth of this psychological transformation, we must look past surface-level behaviors and examine the underlying cognitive restructuring occurring within the brain. Human beings are inherently wired to perceive other people as complex, autonomous agents possessing internal worlds filled with thoughts, feelings, and intentions. This capacity, often referred to as theory of mind, requires a significant amount of neurological bandwidth, particularly for a highly empathetic individual. The empath's brain naturally spends massive computational energy running simulations of the target's mind, constantly trying to map their emotional wounds, track their hidden motivations, and anticipate their volatile behavioral loops. This is a highly intensive strategy of asset allocation, where vast stores of cognitive empathy, patience, and emotional intelligence are consistently funneled toward an unstable relationship. However, Keynote 4 reveals that when the terminal threshold of patience is breached, the brain undergoes a profound process of neurological asset liquidation, completely altering how the target is represented within the empath's mental architecture. During this terminal shift, the brain recognizes that continuing to treat the manipulator as a complex human partner is a catastrophic threat to its own psychological survival. To conserve its rapidly depleting metabolic and emotional resources, the brain initiates a radical cognitive pruning process. It permanently devalues the psychological profile of the manipulator. In a very literal neurological sense, the brain moves the target out of the category of complex human agent with whom I must connect, and places them into an entirely different cognitive schema, an inanimate environmental hazard. The brain stops attempting to run simulations of the target's internal world because it has deemed that information completely useless. It no longer searches for the wounded child behind the narcissistic mask, nor does it try to decipher the complex reasons behind the target's cruelty. The target's behavior is stripped of its personal meaning and recategorized as a predictable, mechanical force of nature. This cognitive liquidation permanently alters the empath's neural responses to the target's presence. When you view someone as a complex human partner, their actions trigger deep emotional resonance within your mirror neuron system. Their pain causes you pain, and their anger causes you anxiety. But when the brain liquidates that asset and recategorizes the person as a simple environmental hazard, that resonance is entirely cut off. If a branch falls from a tree during a storm and nearly hits you, you do not get angry at the branch. You do not try to explain your feelings to the tree. and you do not lose sleep wondering why the storm chose to target you. You simply recognize the branch as a physical hazard, step out of its trajectory, and adjust your path accordingly. This is exactly how the empath's brain begins to process the manipulator. When the target screams, lies, or attempts to gaslight, the empath's neural pathways no longer light up with hurt or panic. Instead, the brain observes the behavior with a cold, detached calculus of a safety system tracking a broken piece of machinery. The emotional infrastructure that once allowed the empath to deeply connect with the target is systematically dismantled and repurposed, ensuring that the manipulator's toxic inputs can no longer penetrate the core psychological architecture. The final parameter we must analyze in this behavioral framework is the permanence of this psychological shift. In the realm of relationship dynamics and interpersonal manipulation, predators and toxic individuals almost always operate under the assumption that cycles are cyclical. They believe that a boundary is merely a temporary wall, that an exit is just a negotiation tactic, and that an emotional shutdown is a phase that can eventually be cracked open with the right combination of time, pressure, or charm. They rely heavily on the predictability of the empath's past behavior, recalling the countless times they pushed the empath to the brink, only for the empath to eventually return, driven by their own guilt, hope, or deep-seated desire for resolution. But Keynote 5 exposes the fatal flaw in the manipulator's playbook, introducing what behavioral mechanics defines as the irreversibility factor. When an individual passes through the absolute threshold of de-authorization and cognitive liquidation, they enter a state that is fundamentally permanent, rendering all future manipulation loops completely and utterly ineffective. To understand why this stage cannot be undone, we must realize that this is not an emotional decision. Emotional states fluctuate wildly. Anger cools down, grief eases, and resentment can be softened by a well-timed apology or a sudden display of vulnerability from the target. If the empath were simply acting out of an intense spike of hurt or rage, the manipulator's traditional tools, such as love bombing, hoovering, pity plays, or shifting the blame, would still possess a statistical chance of success. These tactics are specifically engineered to exploit the emotional conductivity of the empath's nervous system. However, because this final stage is born out of a systemic cognitive conclusion rather than an emotional reaction, the psychological architecture that once made those manipulation tactics effective has been physically dismantled by the brain's efficiency mechanisms. The neural pathways dedicated to holding space for the target have been completely pruned away to protect the organism from further metabolic depletion. When a manipulator attempts to re-engage an empath who has reached this point of no return, they are met with a psychological dead end. The manipulator may try to leverage old inside jokes, bring up shared history, or perform a masterclass in performative remorse. In the past,